The First World War, also known as the Great War, was a deadly global conflict that saw unprecedented levels of carnage and destruction. It began in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, which brought embroiled not only Europe, but Middle East, Africa, Pacific, and Asia into a state of war between two coalitions which lasted until the end of 1918. By the time the war was over and the Allied powers claimed victory, more than 16 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, were dead. The advancing military technologies and the horrors of warfare brought inexplicable disaster to both sides, especially the trenches of the Somme on the Western Front. The front lines of war have little to none respect to the unfortune of the soldiers. British Corporal Jack Wood had only recently arrived in France, but already had witnessed the travesty of friendly fire and been exposed to enemy shelling. He had waded through the mud of the trenches, felt lice crawl across his body and rats scuttle over him as he slept, exhausted, on the front. When he was given a few hours of leave from the waging war on the Western Front, he probably never imagined that he was about to shed his innocence. As he strolled through the streets of a nearby town, there was a shock awaiting him: a brothel. Wood wrote in his diary of how "We had heard rumours of the renowned red lamp with a big No 3 on it, but never thought of the reality of the thing. My first view, I shall never forget. There was a great crowd of fellows, 4 or 5 wide, and about 30 yards in length, waiting just like a crowd waiting for a football cup final. At about 5 minutes to 6, the red lamp was lit. Then commenced the rush to get in. This establishment, marked by its red lamp, was one of the legendary Masons' Tuileries, or legalized brothels that dotted the towns of northern France. These were established through the French sanitation system policy for controlling the spread of venereal disease in soldiers by employing prostitutes that were subject to regular medical inspections. They housed professional prostitutes who worked under the supervision and discipline of a madame. By 1917, there were at least 137 such establishments spread across 35 towns on the Western Front. The brothel industry boomed in wartime France, owing to the large number of men stationed there. Both French and German military authorities opened brothels along the Western Front, giving soldiers access to prostitutes while at the front and on leave. In both countries, the military seized buildings, among them private homes and castles, for use as brothels. Different coloured lanterns designated those for officers and those for enlisted men. Brothels were segregated based on military rank. Officers had access to more expensive prostitutes dedicated only to them. The prostitutes who serviced enlisted men would have made less money, worked longer hours, and seen more clients in a given time period than those intended for officers. The brothel industry boomed in wartime France, owing to the large number of men stationed there. Both French and German military authorities opened brothels along the Western Front, giving soldiers access to prostitutes while at the front and on leave. In both countries, the military seized buildings, among them private homes and castles, for use as brothels. Different coloured lanterns designated those for officers and those for enlisted men. Brothels were segregated based on military rank. Officers had access to more expensive prostitutes dedicated only to them. The prostitutes who serviced enlisted men would have made less money, worked longer hours, and seen more clients in a given time period than those intended for officers. Visits to French brothels by British soldiers were officially sanctioned. It was traditional for the British Army to accept the local customs wherever they were stationed. The French thought nothing of allowing their soldiers to use brothels, and not wanting to offend their allies, the British High Command insisted that they should be kept in bounds for most of the war. Not everyone in authority agreed with such liberal measures. The Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, provided each man with a leaflet offering him some intimate advice. It warned soldiers to keep constantly on your guard against any excesses. In this new experience you may find temptations both in wine and women. You must entirely resist both, but according to one of the recipients, Private Frank Richards, this guidance may as well have not been issued for all the notice we took. The American forces took a different approach. America placed brothels out of bounds for soldiers. Any American soldier who had sex had to report it within 3 hours at medical station for prophylactic treatment. If they got sick without following this procedure, they were fined half their pay and could be tried for neglect of duty. This approach did not always have the desired effect. When the Americans landed in France at the port of Saint-Nazaire, their attendance of illegal brothels contributed to the spread of syphilis and gonorrhea in the city. When America joined the war in 1917, sexually transmitted infection rates soared above 190 cases per 1,000 American men at the French base ports. The brothels, along with the clandestine sex workers, provided men with an escape from the slaughter and filth of the trenches. They were bright and warm, light and jovial. And large or small, intimate or formal, they always had plenty of women to choose from. Corporal Wood described the scene that greeted him inside the Red Lamp. There were 7 young women, I should say by appearance from 28 to 40, made up in the finest of flimsy silk dresses, and then showing the daintiest of lingerie, I suppose for attraction. From the passage came an entrance to a flight of stairs. Here stood Madame taking a franc for admission, and I afterwards found out you paid the lady of choice any sum you cared from a franc upwards. Soldiers did not know when their time might be up. 1 in 10 British soldiers who saw service in France and Flanders was killed there. There were no restraints in France. These young boys had money to spend and knew that they stood a good chance of being killed within a few weeks anyhow. They did not want to die virgins. A brothel visit did not just buy men a momentary release from the war. Sometimes its legacy could be more long-lasting. Venereal disease rates amongst serving soldiers were of great concern to the army authorities. 150,000 men in the British Army were admitted to hospital with a venereal infection whilst stationed in France. Some measures were taken to limit the spread of disease. Each army unit had a treatment station where men could get ointment consisting of mercury and chlorine to prevent infection, or receive a urethral irrigation with potassium permanganate after exposure. But most soldiers had little interest in such precautions. They patronized brothels precisely because they wanted to catch syphilis or gonorrhea. An infection of syphilis or gonorrhea required a hospital stay of about 30 days for treatment, and so for many men this was an attractive option rather than fighting. This was such an enticing option that a prostitute who had venereal disease could actually earn more money than an uninfected one. American soldiers in the trenches who had managed to hide their venereal infection would make money by transferring some of the pus on a matchstick to another man, who also hoped to catch the infection. Venereal diseases were treated with injections of mercury, which usually did nothing to prevent the fatal progression of the disease years later. It was a worthwhile trade-off for some, if it enabled them to escape the carnage of the front line. And that, ultimately, was what brothel visits were all about for many men. They provided an escape, a release from the horror of the trenches. It is undoubtedly true that wherever there is war, there are whores. The women's place in war as a source of motivation and respite for the men on the front lines has been erased, as it doesn't sit well with the accepted notion of war heroes. In some cases, the women were being treated quite badly, and some of the men visiting the brothels will have had wives back home, which she said makes the idea even more difficult to accept. Their stories with the narrative we have of soldiers in the First World War who were heroic, fighting in defense of the nation, fit uncomfortably with the idea of what these men were doing at the front lines. Stay tuned to find out more about the dark side of warfare in history. Lifting the veil on the dark side of historical events, this is Time Capsule. Please like. It is undoubtedly true that wherever there is war, there are whores. The women's place in war as a source of motivation and respite